substantives, right, I have a couple of rebuttals for the other side. First of all, as to the point of dictators and nefarious governments, right, PMCs are unlikely to work, first of all, with nefarious governments or dictatorships, particularly the PMCs who work with Western governments, as it might create conflicts of interest or expose them to bad press, and it works against them because they do have a vested interest in their own self-image and then to uphold their company image. This is how it works. And besides, currently, in the current period of time, right, PMCs are actually trying to rebrand themselves as humanitarian actors. They have a vested interest to appear better, and by taking a contract with the UN, it actually helps them and their self-image, which is why they do have a vested interest in it. They're not likely to go and work with dictators. Okay, and as for screening is just basic screening that any other soldier goes through, and it's to show that they're able to adhere to international humanitarian law. It's to show that they're able to work with the UN with the same kind of values. That's the kind of thing, that kind of basic screening that every soldier goes through, and the same kind of screening that PMCs will also go through. So I don't see what's the problem there. Sit down. Okay, and finally, right, the UN doesn't actually have an incentive to pay the troops that are provided as military aid from other countries, okay? The individual countries are the ones paying their troops, okay? The individual countries are the ones paying, right? And we mentioned how there's obviously a disparity between for example, the income of a US soldier and one of an SG soldier, right? And even if the UN pays, right, there's still a disparity between the income because they're paying the same amount of income to both sides, so that disparity still remains. So I don't see how that's any different on your side of the house, right? And I'm also going to talk about how the fact that we don't really have that kind of time to invest money in like training or whatever, but I'm going to talk about that in my substantive later on, right? Now finally, sit down. The PMCs, they have a home base. I'm pretty sure this was already mentioned in my first speaker's case setup. But the PMCs do have a home base. They are accountable to their own home countries. For example, PMCs that are based in the US, they are accountable to their own US Code of Justice, right? Which means that they cannot go about looting and gallivanting and doing whatever the hell they want because they do have to comply with international law. They have to comply with international law, which is, there's already an international humanitarian law. There's an entire section based entirely for PMCs, and they have to comply with that. Not only do they have to comply with that, they also have to comply with the Code of Justice imposed on them by US countries, and also the host country's law. They have to comply with all of these things. So I don't see how accountability is really a problem. I'm really going to talk about this a bit later. Okay, hang on a second. Okay, fine.
You mentioned after screening, you said that it's going to be normal screening just like every other soldier. Then how about this? Why don't you send UN troops instead of wasting time screening PMCs, considering that both screening is the same?
We're not replacing the UN troops. We're going to add a complement right now. Okay, and I'm going to talk about this a bit later, right? But given the current political climate, there are so many issues going on right now that the UN has to deal with. For example, just now, right, the ceasefire between Israel and Palestine, it just went to hell, and Israel just started a ground invasion. The UN had to call an emergency security council meeting, right? And by the very fact that these things are already existing, right, that more and more problems are coming in every single day. We're not saying replace the entire UN troops, we're saying add to it. We need a complement particularly right now, but I'm going to talk about that. In fact, we're just going to move over into that substantive, but thanks for that point, right? It brought me right in. Anyway, on to my first substantive, the dire need for solutions given the current global climate. Okay, my second substantive is also that about checks and balances, but I'll move on to that later. Now on to my first point, right? Like I said, I just brought up the Israel-Palestine example, right? But there's also Somalia in trouble, there's Kenya in trouble, there's Ukraine, Crimea. The thing is that the UN currently has so many issues and problems in the global political climate to attend to, and currently speaking, the UN does not have the capabilities to attend to all of them with the UN troops as of late, right? And given the current political climate where the UN has to step in on so many conflicts occurring all over the world, we need a solution now. And the solution that would benefit us the most currently is by using PMCs. And we've already brought up in a case setup how there would be mutual benefits on both sides. For example, the UN would have a benefit as to we would have more manpower and better able to keep in control of all kinds of situations occurring all over the world, right? But not only that, PMCs, they also have a vested interest in becoming more humanitarian. They're moving into a situation where they become more better, more humanitarian actors, right? And this is what PMCs are all over the world are trying to do. They're trying to brand themselves with self-image that says, we are now looking into becoming more humanitarian in nature. That is what PMCs want to do right now, which means that both sides have an interest. Not only does the UN have an interest in keeping peace all over the world, the PMCs also have an interest in taking up contracts with the UN. which means that if they have this vested interest, right, they're not going to, all the harms that this side has brought up basically does not fit in with our paradigm. It doesn't fit in because of the very fact that PMCs have an interest to uphold their self-image, and they're not gonna let their soldiers, right, engage in such nefarious things or activities, right? So the entire paradigm falls. Okay, and and also we also brought up the fact that there is a lack of bias for PMC soldiers, right? By hiring them, they're better able, for example, hiring the Gurkhas in the Israel-Palestine conflict, they're less likely to have a political bias or an emotional bias towards any of the sides, and they're better able to carry out peacekeeping operations. Like what they said, we completely agree. The UN is for peacekeeping, which is why we need better trained people on the job without a bias, without an emotional political bias, actually going in ground level and working on keeping peace. That's why we need better peacekeeping troops, and we need more of them, and we need them now, particularly with all the things that are happening right now. And I do agree that, in a sense, a couple of years ago, PMCs, okay, sorry, moving on to my second argument, checks and balances, right? Granted, a couple of years ago, PMCs were in something of a legal black hole, right? But that's not the case now. The thing is, they are no longer in that kind of phase. PMCs now have to operate by host country laws, their own codes, international humanitarian law. There are so many intrinsic and extrinsic checks and balances occurring in status quo, right? And not only with our policy of screening people and making sure that we choose PMCs who are likely to operate, who are definitely going to operate by IHL, who are going to adhere to all these codes and moral standards that adhere with our own UN policies as well as our own values, right? They're also incentivized to go according to these laws and basically not do anything to tarnish their reputation, because they do have reputations to uphold. They do want to probably take more humanitarian contracts and more contracts with other countries, right? And they do have the self-image to uphold. Because of that very fact, right? Because there's a vested self-interest on both sides, there are no real harms brought about by their side. All the harms basically brought about by their side don't actually have any place in the paradigm, and they obviously haven't been listening to our policy because all of these things are already counteracted under our side of the house, which is why I'm very proud to propose.